The ratings agency Moody's says the GNU is likely to support broad policy continuity and economic reform, but it could also lead to a risk of instability. The rand has strengthened along with the JSE as the markets await President Cyril Ramaphosa's cabinet announcement. Independent analyst Khaya Sithole joins us now to unpack the market sentiment. Khaya, very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. So when there was the announcement of the intention of a GNU, we saw the rand strengthening, and I see the Business Day reporting this morning that in reaction to the instability that we are seeing currently, more than 1% has been erased from the previous gains that have been made by the rand. How should we understand what's currently happening and how the markets are seeing the instability?
Good morning and good morning to the viewers. So how we should understand it all is by firstly acknowledging that currency markets and currency traders are notoriously sensitive in the sense that a single piece of sentiment or a hint or a rumor is enough to spur them into action, even if the underlying rumors have got no substance. And why that matters is that obviously, whenever we try to map political conversations and link them to currency movements, we are firstly making the very broad and sometimes dangerous assumption that the market moves of that day are influenced primarily by the political conversations rather than being part of the ordinary market fluctuations that would happen on any other day. So whether it's 1% or 10%, it is remarkably difficult to then strip out the cumulative or the granular effects of the different causes of action. But what we do know is that obviously whenever there are political conversations that make investors who have a long-term view become a bit less certain about what the long-term prospects of the country's policy orientation and the country's economy are going to be, then they tend to react much faster. They tend to be quite reactionary in nature, and they obviously reposition themselves by repositioning their portfolios, and that obviously contributes to market movements. But to try and map a 1% or a 2% movement to a political conversation is remarkably dangerous.
Yeah, and that's the point, right? How do we determine whether that 1% is actually linked to current affairs and the political wrangling over positions?
You absolutely cannot. What you can do is that you can look at the sum of the issues of the day that might influence markets. So there'll be political conversations domestically, but also usually there are much more exogenous factors that drive currency movements. So we do know that obviously some economies are much more powerful than others. So the type of information that emerges from those economies, whether it's the United States or China, tend to have a knock-on effect on other economies like ours who have exposure to those particular markets. So whenever somebody says there's been a currency movement, you literally have to try and define the spectrum of issues that generally influence currency movements. And only if you can identify that there's been a significant political event that has a significant impact on the expectations of what currency traders do and they don't do, only then should you try and narrow down or link it to a political conversation. Otherwise, I mean, 1% movement in the currency market seems to be more of a daily occurrence rather than something, monumental.
Yeah, the concern that's raised by Moody's in their statement about the risk of potential instability, do you think that what we are currently seeing playing out really speaks to that, considering that letter as well that has been leaked from the Democratic Alliance?
No, the reason we're having all of this wrangling before everybody signs into paper what the agreement is going to be is precisely so that you avoid that potential instability. What you don't want is a fragile and a tentative agreement where people say, well, let's play it by the ear, only to discover a week or a couple of months later that perhaps I signed up for a ministry that I don't have the capacity to run. So the fact that this is being ventilated up front and that people are obviously trading, these positions up front means that by the time a particular party says that this is what we've signed up for, we should legitimately assume that they've applied their minds, their capacity to run that portfolio, and also their ability to manage it over a 5-year period. So I prefer the instability up front so that by the time people say we've reached a meeting of the minds, it means that they've already deliberated on the potential pitfalls and the obviously potential areas of divergence so that we have more stability on the other side of the agreement.
I wonder whether the safe way to go for the president around this could be, considering, and you've written about this as well, the interpretation of the various members when it comes to clause 19 of the statement of intent as well as clause 24 of that statement of intent. Perhaps that maybe the president should go the interim transitional government route while you deal with all the other policy-related issues so that you have that stability that is required, but you also have a government at least that is in place, even though it is only for the interim?
I don't think so. I think at this stage, we're probably much closer towards the end of the negotiations than we were even a couple of days ago. So the idea of putting an interim structure will be to give the impression that the still existing divergence points are so wide that they do not think they're unlikely to resolve them in the matter of days. So if that obviously becomes the new iteration of this agreement, it will create more anxieties because the questions will be, well, how difficult can it be to simply then reach a meeting of the minds about who should be the custodian of which portfolio? So I think that alternative approach would then indicate that perhaps it will take much longer to reach an agreement. And that simply means that perhaps there isn't really a meeting of the minds about how this government should function. And I think that would create more anxiety. So I don't think we should be opting for an interim structure because I think it will simply delay the process and we do not know what the consequences of the delay might be. I think the main difference, obviously, between the time that we were deliberating on this last week and now is that we now do have a list of parties that are legitimately referred to as the founding partners of this particular alliance. And I think prematurely, the DA had regarded itself as a founding partner only on the basis that it signed the agreement on a particular day. But my understanding was that the open invitation would be there available to all parties. And once everybody has said we're responding to this initial invitation, then they should be designated as the founding partners, which means that the next party that seems to try to enter this agreement much later on is a party that should then be subject to that consultation clause where everybody should be consulted that we should admit that prospective member. So we do have the founding partners now, which are the 10 parties. And of course, on that basis, they can now proceed and decide how to allocate portfolios and how to allocate positions. And from our understanding, the statement of intent is very clear that even though the president has got the ultimate prerogative, he needs to be as inclusive as possible. And that's really where the conversations are at this stage.
Yeah, but that difference in policy approach and also the understanding, at least look at, for instance, how the ANC and the Democratic Alliance are arguing around the allocation of positions and also the debate that is being thrown forward towards the government, towards a national dialogue. That national dialogue would also inform what type of government we actually want and what type of policies we should actually be approaching. Do you think that that's an easy task?
Well, at this stage, we must acknowledge that the ANC is the founding party. It is the leading party of this particular alliance. It is the ANC's policies that are really going to be the point of implementation over the next couple of years. The other parties, whether you look at the DA with its 22%, are unlikely to essentially usher in an overhaul of the country's policy orientation. So I do not expect them to certainly, some of the clauses in this particular statement, they're very clear that, look, we are going to maintain the way things have been done in relation to how government and cabinet decisions are made and the policies of the country are as follows. And of course, we can deliberate on how we prioritize them. But the idea that we're suddenly going to get a brand new playbook is very unlikely in my view, particularly if it's going to be championed by a party that still only commanded 22% of the vote in the general election.
Yeah, in the statement from Moody's, again, they say if the coalition government endures, the partnership between the ANC and the DA has the potential to revive South Africa's, quote, rainbow nation narrative due to higher perceived socio-ethnic cohesion, which would support policy effectiveness. And if we look also around how the markets view the Democratic Alliance as a governing party, at least where they govern, in the Western Cape, the example that is being made, is this the intention to say that the best political party to work with the ANC would be the next biggest party in the country, which is the Democratic Alliance?
That is the impression that, organizations like Moody's and other currency speculators would prefer. And obviously, their reasoning is that, look, between the spectrum of big parties that the ANC could have collaborated with, the other parties like the EFF or the MK would have required many more deliberations about what it is that was going to be championed and how it is going to be championed. And obviously, some of the strongly held positions by the EFF and the MK party in particular are quite different from how the ANC has approached similar issues. So that will take much more to try and figure out, well, what is it that we're going to do if you have a party that strongly believes in a particular policy reorientation and the ANC doesn't. what seems to be the key issue here is that the view that is held by Moody's is that you find it would be much easier to find the meeting of the minds or the middle ground between the ANC and the DA, in the sense that the ANC has, over the past 30 years, had to deal with the question of, well, our members, our constituencies would like that particular policy, but in our responsibility as a government, we then have to actually understand the trade-offs, inherent in the implementation, and then find a middle ground. So the ANC has, for 30 years, had to deal with the dual responsibility of being accountable to its members and also being accountable to society at large. So obviously the DA itself is also a party that says, look, having been in government, we kind of know that as ambitious as our members might be, it's not always possible or feasible to implement everything to the letter. So it's a party that has learned what the nuances of governance are. So you are dealing with two parties that kind of understand that, yes, we know what our members want, but we also know what the practical realities and the resource limitations within the state are. So it's much easier for them to find a meeting of the minds. I think new parties that still say, look, we come here with a constituency that says this is what needs to be done, we need to push you as far as possible, it makes the conversations much more difficult. So when you hear a statement from Moody's, it is on their understanding that you find it much easier to reach that end point of a decision making between these parties than it would be with new parties that have widely different approaches to policy formulation and implementation.
Yeah, considering that leaked letter from the Democratic Alliance that Helen Zille sent to the Secretary General of the ANC, and looking at the number of cabinet posts that the DA is looking for, would the markets look at this and say that, sure, it's one thing to be part of a government of national unity, but what is also crucial is who gets which position? Do the markets care who gets what? The Democratic Alliance, as an example, for instance, they say they want public service and administration. COSATU, which is an alliance with the ANC, is saying there's no way that you can give that political party that position.
I think the markets take an interest into what that is, but also keep in mind that that letter is a very important political instrument for a party like the Democratic Alliance, which wants to be able to go to its members long after every agreement is inked in and say, look, when we were negotiating, we actually wanted to target these particular ministries because we understand what their importance is. They know very well they're not going to get everything that they wanted, but they should, or they want to be able to then say in future electoral and political campaigning that actually you do realize that when we ask for these particular positions, it's because we wanted to be able to achieve these particular things. So perhaps when we get to the next general election, if you guys want us to be able to take those positions without having to beg the ANC for it, then they give us a greater share of the vote. So I regard it as a political bargaining tool. And obviously the fact that it was leaked out there means that DA members, for example, would be like, oh, it clearly is a party that has identified the most important ministries and it wants to be able to run them. The fact that they're not going to get them ultimately is a secondary matter. So it's part of a longer-term political optics that the DA wants to have as its instrument in future conversations where it says, well, if the police ministry or if the home affairs portfolio is not working out, keep in mind that we tried to actually run it because we thought we could run it better. So therefore, if you think that the ANC firstly denied it to us and then they're not doing as well as they should, then perhaps give us a greater share of the vote next time, give us greater bargaining power so that perhaps it may move into our hands. So we must always be very clear that not everything that they put in paper is essentially, cast in stone. It's all part of a bigger political optics game that every party plays.
The African peer review mechanism under the African Union issued a statement just after the announcement of the election results. And this was in response to what Fitch has said. And they accused Fitch of political interference in South Africa's society. Can Moody's also be accused of political interference?
No, I think the term interference is quite, radical in the sense that obviously when one talks about interfering politically, you then have to be able to say that on the basis of a statement that Fitch or Moody's has issued, then obviously the political role players did things differently or didn't do things differently. I don't think the negotiators are sitting out there and saying, well, actually, these are the portfolios that we want. These are the ministries that play. But Fitch says that this should go there, so therefore that should be the basis for our decision making. That would simply be remarkably myopic, and it shouldn't be the way things are done. And the idea that obviously people are interfering with the political process seems to imply that maybe you issue these types of statements when people are going to the polls in order to influence their decision making at the polls, because ultimately what we're dealing with here is the implementation of a decision that was made by the citizens of South Africa on the 29th of May. And I do not believe that any of them were influenced by Fitch or could have been influenced by Fitch if it issued that statement even beforehand. So I wouldn't use the word political interference. Perhaps influence is more appropriate, but interference seems to be a bit of a radical interpretation of how influential these documents tend to be.
Well, certainly. Also, they speak about the MK party as well as the EFF having some radical policy proposals. Thank you so much for your time. That is Khaya Sithole, who's an independent analyst.